Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
Good morning, I'm John Tucker.
And I'm Karen Moscow. Here are the stories we're following today.
And Karen, futures are getting a lift on this last trading day, the holiday shortened week, on optimism over trade talks. President Trump says negotiators made, quote, big progress in a meeting with Japanese officials who are seeking to avoid higher levies that he's threatened against U.S. trading partners. Let's get more from Bloomberg Tokyo Bureau Chief Isabel Reynolds.
Japan's negotiator Akazawa, he's been the focus of global attention, really, because he's been first in the line to try and get a reprieve from these global tariffs. He was preparing for talks with the Commerce Secretary and the Treasury Secretary. While he was on his way to Washington, suddenly Trump announces, oh, I'm going to be part of these negotiations. So that must have been rather a shock for him. It's rather unclear what actually happened in the end, but what seems to have happened, in fact, is that Akazawa went to the White House and had brief talks with Trump ahead of the actual negotiations.
Bloomberg's Isabel Reynolds says the talks did not result in an immediate halt on the tariffs, but preparations are underway for a second round of talks to take place later this month.
Well, John, Chinese President Xi Jinping is making a diplomatic push to counter U.S. pressure on nations to limit trade ties with Beijing. He is wrapping up a three-nation tour of Southeast Asia, and Xi promoted the idea of a, quote, Asian family and called for regional unity.
And Goldman Sachs says U.S. investors could be forced to offload up to $800 billion in Chinese stocks in a worst-case financial decoupling with China. In the same scenario, Chinese investors might need to unload their U.S. financial assets, which could amount to $1.7 trillion. And Carlyle Group CEO Harvey Schwartz says that global economic growth relies on the two countries finding a way to work together.
I don't think it's a good outcome if the number one and two largest economies in the world haven't found an equilibrium around cooperation. It's really critical for the global economy and for trade that we and China find a place of cooperation and an equilibrium. And I think the faster that can happen, the better it is for all business activity globally, especially in the United States.
Carlyle Group CEO Schwartz was speaking to Shanali Basek for Bloomberg Originals' upcoming series Bullish.
Well, John, we turn to the markets now, and futures are higher following yesterday's sell-off on Wall Street. The S&P 500 dropped 2.25%, and the Nasdaq fell 3% after Fed Chair Jay Powell said trade tensions risk undermining the Fed's employment and inflation goals. Powell spoke at the Economic Club of Chicago.
The level of tariff increases announced so far is significantly larger than anticipated, and the same is likely to be true of the economic effects, which will include higher inflation and slower growth.
Powell's remarks, heard live here on Bloomberg, reinforce a message he has repeatedly emphasized. Fed officials are in no hurry to change the central bank's benchmark policy rate. The Fed next decides on May 7th.
And monetary policy also in focus this morning overseas. The European Central Bank set to make an interest rate decision. Now let's get the very latest from Bloomberg's Ewan Potts in London. Ewan, good morning.
John and Karen, while the Fed may be in no hurry to change rates, that is exactly what we're expecting today from Frankfurt. 61 of 62 economists in Bloomberg's survey reckon the European Central Bank will cut rates at their lunchtime meeting. That will take the deposit rate from 2.5% to 2.25%. The threat of swinging tariffs from the United States putting pay to any talk of a pause at this meeting. And investors expect at least 2 more rate cuts later this year. But you won't be surprised to hear there is a lot of uncertainty around the outlook. In London, I'm Ewan Potts, Bloomberg Radio.
All right, Ewan, thank you. Well, back here in the U.S., the government's antitrust trial seeking to break up Meta Platforms continues today. Now, some may think of Meta Platforms as a giant conglomerate, but according to Mark Zuckerberg, the company is fighting for its survival. We get more with Bloomberg's Denise Pellegrini.
At a marathon 3 days of testimony in the Federal Trade Commission's trial to break up Meta, the CEO of the company that owns Facebook, Insta, WhatsApp, and Threads testified Facebook is fighting for its existence even when it's ahead. The FTC wants to force Meta to sell off Insta and WhatsApp, citing emails and documents that suggest Meta bought the companies to eliminate competitive threats. But Zuckerberg and Meta's lawyers say staying alive in the fast-moving world of social media requires staying nimble. And they also say the acquisitions didn't harm competition. The outcome of the trial is uncertain. Denise Pellegrini, Bloomberg Radio.
All right, thanks, Denise. And shares of Hertz, they are driving higher this morning. In fact, they're soaring 25%. CNBC is reporting Bill Ackman's Pershing Square Capital Management has amassed a position of almost 20% in the car rental company.
And finally, John, Harvard University's refusal to comply with the Trump administration deal to require it to reform its governance and diversity programs is resulting in retribution. The administration's freezing funding of $2.2 billion of multi-year grants, accusing Harvard of mishandling antisemitism on campus. President Trump said the school should lose its tax-exempt status, and several outlets reported that the IRS is considering the issue. But Larry Summers, former U.S. Treasury Secretary and former president at Harvard, tells Bloomberg the university needed to push back on the administration's requests.
Harvard should not go interjecting itself into politics. But God, when it is the object of an extra legal set of orders and threats, I don't think it had any viable choice at all but to respond strongly.
And former U.S. Treasury Secretary Larry Summers also told Bloomberg that President Trump's actions toward Harvard are part of an effort to suppress institutions that challenge his administration. You can catch David Weston's full conversation with Summers on the Bloomberg podcast page on YouTube. Time now for a look at some of the other stories making news in New York and around the world. And for that, we're joined by Bloomberg's Michael Barr. Michael, good morning.
Good morning, Karen. A federal judge said there is probable cause to hold Trump administration officials in criminal contempt of court for sending accused Venezuelan gang members to an El Salvador prison last month, despite his order to immediately halt the deportations. U.S. District Judge James Boasberg issued an order saying that officials acted in willful disregard. The administration plans to appeal the ruling. Maryland Senator Chris Van Hollen has flown to El Salvador to find out more about Kilmar Abrego Garcia's detention. The Maryland man was being detained in the notorious El Salvador prison after he was deported last month. A federal judge found Abrego Garcia's detention unlawful and ordered the administration to facilitate his return to the U.S. Van Hollen says he had met with U.S. Embassy personnel and Salvadoran officials.
This is simply about letting him have his day in court. We use the courts to make sure that we don't convict people who are not guilty and that we convict those who are.
Meanwhile, the Trump administration wants a U.S. appeals court to block a judge's directive that government officials be questioned about their failure to seek the return of Abrego Garcia. Attorney General Pam Bondi.
He is not coming back to our country. President Bukele said he was not sending him back. That's the end of the story.
AG Bondi says the administration believes Abrego Garcia was a member of MS-13, an allegation his family denies. 10 New York prison guards have been charged in connection with the fatal beating of a 22-year-old prison inmate, including 2 charged with murder. Prisoner Messiah Natwi at the Mid-State Correctional Facility was sent to a hospital where he died on March 1st. Onondaga County District Attorney William Fitzpatrick.
The first count charges 2 individuals, corrections officers Jonah Levy and Caleb Blair, with depraved mind murder. Not an intentional murder, but a murder so depraved and so wanton and disregarding of human life that New York law allows it to rise to the level of intentional murder.
DA Fitzpatrick says other guards are accused of trying to cover it up. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Michael Barr, and this is Bloomberg. Karen.
All right, Michael Barr, thank you. Time now for the Bloomberg Sports Update. Here's John Stashower. John, good morning.
Good morning, Karen. All good for the Yankees. They got Clark Schmidt back in the rotation. Pitched well in his season debut. They got a 7th-inning go-ahead home run from Aaron Judge, his first homer in 11 games, and a game-saving diving catch in right field from Clay Bellinger for the final out of a 4-3 win over Kansas City. They sweep the series, played tonight at Tampa Bay. It'll feel very much like a Yankee home game. The Rays' home stadium is where the Yankees play their spring training games. The Mets in Minnesota held scoreless for 7 innings. They tied the game with 3 in the 8th, but lost to the Twins 4-3 and 10. Red Sox won 1-0 to Tampa Bay. David Hamilton's homer, the only run. Nationals lost in Pittsburgh 6-1. The Orioles won 9-1 over Cleveland. Jackson Holliday hit a grand slam. And Toronto's 3-1 win over Atlanta. The Blue Jays set a club record. 5 pitchers had 19 strikeouts. The Braves are now 5-13. NBA play-in, 2 wins for the road teams. Miami in Chicago. Tyler Hero scored 38. Dallas in Sacramento. Sacramento as the Mavs won the second quarter by 25. The Heat and the Mavs will play tomorrow in Atlanta and in Memphis to see who gets the last playoff spots. Then Saturday, it's the Knicks and Pistons. Game 1 at the Garden. Detroit won only 14 games last season, 44 wins this year. The Knicks coach is Tom Thibodeau.
They've had a great season. I think, JB's done a great job there. That they added I think, really good veterans to complement, the young players that they have. And a lot of their guys have made big steps. You look at the development of Duran and Stewart, and obviously the obvious one is Cunningham.
Yeah, all Cade Cunningham did this season has averaged 26 points, 6 rebounds, and 9 assists per game. Last Stanley Cup playoff spot goes to Montreal. This after the Canadiens won only 8 of their first 24 games. John Stashhammer, Bloomberg Sports. Karen and John.
Coast to coast on Bloomberg Radio, nationwide on Sirius XM, and around the world on Bloomberg.com and the Bloomberg Business app. This is Bloomberg Daybreak.
And that brings us to 5:12 on Wall Street. Well, the markets, they continue to be whipsawed by trade uncertainty. And let's try to get a handle on where things stand right now with Bloomberg senior editor Bill Ferry is joining us this morning. Bill, thanks for being with us. Wall Street seems to be grasping at some positive signs in the trade talks between the U.S. and Japan. Let me put the question out there. Is that hope well placed this morning?
Yeah, I think the jury is out on that. President Trump going online yesterday to say that big progress had been made in the trade talks with the Japanese team, and definitely this Japanese delegation is being seen as a test case by dozens of countries that are hoping to see just what it will take to strike a deal with the Trump administration. But I got to point out, it was a very relatively short meeting for a trade negotiation. The top Japanese negotiator met with Trump for about 50 minutes, and then he met with officials from Treasury and Commerce for just over an hour, about an hour and 15 minutes. So usually trade deals are really detailed back and forth negotiations that take hundreds of hours and weeks. So they have scheduled a second round of meetings later in this month, but that 90-day clock that President Trump put on reaching deals with other countries is already ticking.
And to be sure, the levies remain in place for Japan at this juncture.
That's right. What Japan is wanting to do, they want to see the full 24% tariffs, the reciprocal, so-called reciprocal tariffs wiped away. They'd like to see that 10% kind of baseline tariff also gone. And those are the kind of things I think investors and the markets are going to really be looking at when if they finally come to a deal. They're going to see, is it possible? How far back can you roll these tariffs? How far is President Trump willing to go?
That's Japan. Are talks with other countries right now going on?
Well, the administration says that there are talks maybe at lower levels taking place. We know South Korea is preparing to send a delegation. We've heard Scott Bessent talking about countries like Argentina and even India being near the front of the queue. But in terms of the substantive talks, President Trump said he wants to sign off on all these deals. He popped into this meeting with the Japanese. For him to do so with all these other countries is definitely going to take a lot of time.
Okay. At the same time, Fed Chair Powell, it doesn't sound like he's going to ride to the rescue as the trade war continues. What's happening on that front?
Well, he's definitely signaling kind of a wait-and-see approach here so far, even though I think the markets have been pricing in between 3 and 4 rate cuts this year. He said that, the Fed needs to see price stability before they really make a move, that he wants to make sure that inflation, the bump up in inflation expected from tariffs doesn't become a longer-term problem. Remember, the Fed got burned during the pandemic when they said that the inflation was temporary or it was in a transitory. After the pandemic was winding down, it wasn't transitory. It climbed higher. It became a political problem, became an economic problem. They don't want that to happen again, so they're really more in a wait-and-see mode.
It's hard to de-link trade and foreign relations. The Chinese President Xi Jinping, he's on a 3-nation Southeast Asia tour, and the message there seems to be you can't rely on the U.S., but you can rely on us.
Yeah, so Xi Jinping in Cambodia today. He's already visited Malaysia and Vietnam. Those are countries that also have good trading relationships with the U.S., and Vietnam in particular has become a place where supply chains have been rerouting as companies tried to move out of China. Now, a lot of those countries are starting to have a second look at China, seeing it as perhaps a more stable economic partner to have. And they're also worried about, these same reciprocal tariffs and some of the other trade issues that the U.S. is bringing up. So it'll be very interesting to see where that develops.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak, your morning podcast on the stories making news from Wall Street to Washington and beyond.
Look for us on your podcast feed by 6 a.m. Eastern each morning on Apple, Spotify, or anywhere else you listen.
You can also listen live each morning starting at 5 a.m. Wall Street time on Bloomberg 1130 in New York, Bloomberg 99.1 in Washington, Bloomberg 92.9 in Boston, and nationwide on Sirius XM Channel 121.
Plus, listen coast to coast on the Bloomberg Business app, now with Apple CarPlay and Android Auto interfaces.
And don't forget to subscribe to Bloomberg News Now. It's the latest news whenever you want it, in 5 minutes or less. Search Bloomberg News Now on your favorite podcast platform to stay informed all day long. I'm Karen Moscow.
I'm John Tucker. Join us again tomorrow morning for all the news you need to start your day right here on Bloomberg Daybreak.